she found out on a Thursday, which was an ordinary day in every other respect. The fire had been lit in the east sitting room before she came downstairs. The post had arrived and been sorted on the side table in the entrance hall, as it always was, by someone who understood that the ordering of small things was a form of care, even when no one acknowledged it as such. The morning had the quality of mornings that have been made comfortable by a person who attends to comfort as a matter of course, without requiring the comfort to be noticed or its making to be recognized. She had been making this house comfortable for 19 months, not as a performance, not as a strategy, simply because she was a person who, when she was somewhere, made the somewhere worth being in, and she had been here, and she had made it worth being in, and the making had been the whole and sufficient justification for itself. She had not required anything in return for it. That was not entirely true. She had required one thing, or had believed she was receiving one thing, which was the understanding that the making was permanent, that she was permanent, that the arrangement they were in, which had never been formally named, but which had the weight and the dailiness and the particular texture of a shared life, was building towards something rather than simply existing inside its own indefinite present. She had believed this because he had not contradicted it, and not contradicting, she had understood for 19 months, was the same as confirming. She had been wrong about that. She found out on a Thursday through a letter that had not been addressed to her, and that she had not opened, but whose contents had been conveyed to her by the same efficient, well-meaning household machinery that had been making her mornings comfortable for a year and a half, in the form of a single sentence delivered by a woman who had not understood what she was delivering. The sentence was not long. It did not need to be. It said that the Duke had been in correspondence with Lord Harwick regarding his daughter, and that the matter was apparently at an advanced stage, and that Mrs. Holt had thought she should know, in the particular tone of a woman who was delivering information she considered important, without fully understanding that it was going to be the last piece of information she delivered to this particular person in this particular house. She should know. She did know, and what she knew, standing in the entrance hall on a Thursday morning, with the post still sorted on the side table, and the fire lit in the east sitting room, was that temporary had a shape she had not previously understood, and that the shape was this. It looked exactly like permanent until the moment it didn't, and the moment it didn't was not announced in advance. He had told her, once, in the early months, that he was a man of practical arrangements. He had said it without malice, which was the part she kept returning to. He had said it in the way that people state facts about themselves, that they consider established and uncontroversial, the way one says that one prefers the north wing or keeps to a particular schedule, simply and without any apparent understanding that the fact being stated might be received as something other than neutral information. She had heard it, and she had filed it, and she had told herself, with the particular reasoning of a person who is already too deeply in something to assess it clearly, that practical arrangements were not incompatible with genuine ones, that a man who stated his nature plainly was preferable to a man who concealed it, and that the practical arrangement they were in was acquiring, day by day, the substance of something more than practical. She had been making an argument to herself. She understood that now. The argument had been well constructed and sincerely believed and wrong, and the wrongness of it was not something she was going to be able to be angry about. Because the argument had been hers, made to herself, and there was no one to receive the anger but the person who had constructed it. She was not angry. She was something colder and more clarifying than anger, which was the particular state of a woman who has understood something completely, and is now simply deciding what to do with the understanding. She was going to leave. That was the decision, and it had been made before she had fully registered that she was making it, in the way that certain decisions arrive not as conclusions but as recognitions. Not I have decided, but I see that it is already decided, has been decided, required only the information to make itself visible. She would leave before he could do what the letter suggested he was arranging to do, which was to make the temporariness official in the precise and irreversible way of a man who had found a permanent arrangement and was preparing to close the practical one that had been serving in its place. She would leave because she had not understood she was serving in place of something, and because the not understanding had been the result of a sustained and apparently very comfortable assumption on his part that she would continue, not understanding indefinitely, and because she was not going to be the person who remained in a room after it had become clear that remaining was the only remaining option. She would leave with her dignity entirely intact, because her dignity was the one thing in this house that had always been entirely hers, and she intended to take it with her when she went. This is that story. Subscribe to this channel now, because what comes after the leaving is what this is really about, and it does not go where you expect, and you need to be here from the beginning to understand what it costs him to finally understand what he had. Turn on the bell. This story is told in full or not at all. She had arrived in his life through a circumstance that both of them had recognized from the beginning as something other than accidental. A mutual acquaintance, a gathering at which they had both been present, a conversation that had extended beyond its occasion, and then extended again at the next occasion, and then begun to generate its own occasions with the quiet momentum of something that is building because both parties have decided, without entirely acknowledging the decision, to allow it to build. She had known what she was walking into. She had known it in the way that clear-eyed people always know what they are walking into, which was not completely, not with the full transparency that hindsight eventually provides, but accurately enough to have made a choice rather than simply fallen into a situation. She had chosen toward him. She had done so with the understanding that he was a complicated man in the specific way of men who have organized their lives around the avoidance of complication, who have arrived at an elaborate simplicity through the careful management of everything that might require them to be vulnerable, and who are therefore, paradoxically, more complicated than the men who have simply allowed the complication to happen. She had found this interesting rather than deterring. That was her first error, and it was not a small one. He was not unkind. That was the thing she returned to most consistently in the 19 months of the arrangement, not as exculpation, but as the fact that made everything else more difficult to pass. A kind man is harder to leave than an unkind one, not because kindness is a reason to stay in a situation that has no future, but because kindness without commitment produces a particular kind of confusion that is its own form of harm, slow and unannounced and entirely plausible deniable by the person doing the harming, who can at any point observe with complete accuracy that they have never been unkind. He had never been unkind. He had been present in the ways that presence is legible, in the morning conversations that had become routine, in the evenings that had acquired a rhythm she had not designed, and he had not objected to, in the small attentions that accumulate over 19 months into something that looks very much like a life shared between two people who have chosen to share it. He had been present in all of those ways, and absent in the one way that she had not understood, was missing until the letter made it impossible to continue not understanding, which was the way of a man who has decided. He had not decided. She understood that now, with a clarity that was almost impersonal, the clarity of someone looking at a fact from the outside rather than the inside of it. He had been enjoying what they had, without requiring it to become anything, without examining what it was, without asking himself the question that she had been answering for 19 months, with her dailiness and her staying and her making of the house worth being in. The question was, what is this? He had never asked it. He had never asked it because he had never needed to, because she had been there and her being there had been sufficient, and sufficient, for a man of practical arrangements, was the whole of what was required. She had been sufficient. She had not been chosen. There was a difference, and it was the difference between a woman who fills a space and a woman who is wanted in the space, and she had spent 19 months being the former, while believing herself to be the latter, and the letter had clarified the distinction with a precision that no amount of morning conversation and evening rhythm could now undo. She packed on a Friday, one trunk, and the packing of it was a lesson in what was hers and what had simply been available during her residence, which turned out to be a more clarifying question than she had expected. The things that were hers were fewer than the things that were present, and fewer than the things she had been treating as hers. and the discrepancy was instructive in a way that she absorbed without drama and with the precise attention she had always brought to things that deserved to be understood accurately. She took what was hers. She left what was not. She arranged for the trunk to be removed on Saturday morning, before he was typically awake, because she had decided that the leaving was not going to be a scene, was not going to be an occasion that gave him the opportunity to say things that were kind and inadequate, and that she would have to receive without being able to prevent receiving, and that she had no interest in a farewell that would allow him to feel that the parting had been managed well, when the parting was entirely the result of things that had not been managed at all. She left a note. It was brief. It said that she hoped he was well, and that she had found the arrangement valuable, and that she wished him well in the matter of Lord Harwick's daughter. She said all of this without cruelty and without the elaborate courtesy of someone performing composure, and she meant all of it, which was the part she found most difficult, not the leaving, but the meaning of the polite words, the genuine wish that he would be well, the genuine absence of the particular malice that a cleaner situation might have licensed. She did not have the malice available. She had only the clarity, and the clarity, when she folded the note and placed it on the table in the east sitting room beside the fire that had been lit before she came downstairs for the last time, felt like the most honest thing she had done in 19 months. She left on a Saturday morning in the grey light before the house was fully awake, and she did not look back at the windows, and the trunk was loaded and the carriage moved, and the house receded behind her, and she sat in the carriage with her hands in her lap, and the October morning cold outside the glass, and understood that she was entirely and precisely herself again, in the way that she had been before the arrangement, before the 19 months, before she had made a house worth living in for a man who had not understood that was what she was doing or what it cost, or what it meant that she had done it. She was herself. It was a cold clarity, and she allowed it to be cold. If you are still with this story, you already understand what the note cost her to write, and what the leaving cost her to make, and why she made it anyway. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell, because what comes next is the part she did not see coming, and it is the part that the story has been building toward since the first sentence. He found the note on a Saturday morning at an hour when the house had not yet disclosed that anything was different, in the way that houses do not immediately disclose changes in their human content, continuing to function with the same fires and the same post and the same quality of mourning for some minutes after the alteration has occurred. He had come downstairs at the usual hour, and the fire was lit, and the post was sorted, and the house was precisely as it always was in every external particular, and he had come to the east sitting room for the morning in the usual way, and the note was on the table where a number of other things usually rested, and he had picked it up without particular attention and read it again, and then set it down and stood in the east sitting room for a long time without moving. He was trying to understand what had happened, not the literal content of the note, which was clear and plain and left no ambiguity about its meaning, but the thing underneath the literal content, which was the question of how he had arrived at a Saturday morning with a note on his table, and a house that had the particular quality of a house from which something necessary had been removed, and not known that this was coming. He had not known. That was the thing he stood with in the east sitting room for the 20 minutes before Mrs. Holt came to inquire whether he would be taking breakfast, and the 20 minutes were the most uncomfortable 20 minutes he had spent in recent memory, because they were 20 minutes in which the architecture of a comfortable assumption was being dismantled from the inside, and the dismantling was producing, in its wake, a view of the structure that had been there all along, which was not the structure he had believed he was living in. He had believed he was living in a practical arrangement between two people who understood its nature. He had believed this because it required the least of him to believe it, and because she had never contradicted it, and because not contradicting, he had assumed, was the same as accepting, and because the assuming had been comfortable, and the assuming had been wrong, and the wrongness was now standing in the east sitting room with him, legible in every detail of a room that she had made worth being in, and that was now, without her, a room that was maintained. He sat down. That was the thing he would remember afterward, not the contents of the note, not the quality of the morning, but the sitting down, the physical fact of a man whose legs had simply declined to continue supporting him in the upright position because something about the situation had made upright feel dishonest. He sat and he looked at the fire and he allowed himself to understand, with the full and unmanaged force of something that had been waiting for him for 19 months, what the arrangement had actually been. It had not been a practical arrangement between two people who understood its nature. It had been a woman who had chosen toward him with the full intelligence of someone who understood what she was choosing toward and had brought to the choosing everything she had. Her dailiness, her making of things worth being in, her presence in his mornings and evenings, and the particular quality of attention she had brought to his life, without ever requiring him to name what the attention was, and had received in return the comfortable assumption of a man who had never asked what it was because asking would have required him to answer, and answering would have required him to decide, and deciding was the one thing he had organized his entire life around not needing to do. He had not decided, he had allowed. He had allowed her to make his house a house, and his mornings mornings, and his evenings evenings, and he had allowed it with the ease of a man receiving something he has not been required to request, and he had not understood until she had removed herself from the allowing what it was that had been given, or what it would mean when the giving stopped. Mrs. Holt came to the doorway. She said breakfast was ready. He looked at her. He said that he understood she had spoken to the Duchess the previous day. Mrs. Holt's expression did not change, which was not the same as her face, not moving. She said she had informed Her Grace of a correspondence she had thought Her Grace should be aware of. He said she understood that had been the precipitating event. Mrs. Holt said that she understood that, and that she hoped she had not overstepped. He was quiet for a moment. He said she had not overstepped. He said she had done what a person of good judgment does when they believe someone they respect is in possession of insufficient information, and that he had no criticism of that, and that his own role in the situation was a different matter entirely. Mrs. Holt said nothing. She was a woman of considerable professionalism, and she chose this moment to exercise it fully. He went to find her. Not that day. He spent the day with the discomfort of what he was understanding, which was necessary, and which he did not attempt to abbreviate. But the following Monday, when he had sat with what he had done, and what it had cost, and what it said about the man he had been, and had arrived at a clarity that was not the clarity of someone who has resolved a situation, but of someone who has finally, accurately seen one. He found out where she had gone through channels he was not particularly proud of using, which was itself a form of information about how much the usual mechanisms of his comfort were costing him. Now that the cost was visible, she was at her family's estate, a 3-hour journey north, and he made the journey without sending word ahead, because he understood that sending word ahead was a form of managing the encounter that he did not have the right to, and that arriving unannounced was a form of honesty that the situation required, even if it was the uncomfortable kind. She received him. He had not entirely expected that, and the not expecting had told him something about what he had learned in the past 3 days, about how much he had been taking for granted, and the learning sat in him with the particular weight of things that should have been understood much earlier, and had not been. They walked, because she had suggested it, and because suggesting a walk was a way of ensuring that the conversation happened in a space. Neither of them was required to defend, and he had agreed, because agreeing was the only honest response available to a man in his position. He said, after they had walked for some minutes in a quiet that was not comfortable, but that was, he thought, honest, that he had found the note on Saturday. She said she had expected that. He said he had spent the intervening days attempting to account for the gap between what he had believed the arrangement was and what the note had made clear it had been. She said she thought the gap was relatively self-explanatory. He said it was. He said that what was less self-explanatory to him, or rather, what was only now becoming explanatory at the cost of a considerable amount of discomfort, was the nature of the assumption he had been making, which was not the assumption that she was content. He had not asked whether she was content, and that was itself part of what he was accounting for. But the assumption that the arrangement could continue indefinitely without his ever having to decide what it was. She looked at him. He continued, because he had spent 3 days constructing this, and he was going to say it, properly or not at all. He said he had been a man who had organized his life around the avoidance of deciding, and that the avoidance had been comfortable and had been possible, because the things that required his decision had continued functioning without his deciding, because there had always been someone managing the functioning, and that he had mistaken the managing for the arrangement's natural state rather than understanding it for what it was, which was a person who had chosen to be there and who was therefore also capable of choosing not to be. She was quiet for a moment. She said she had told him in the early months that she was not interested in arrangements that existed because no one had examined them closely, enough to see they should end. He said she had. He said he had not understood, when she said it, that she was describing the risk she was taking by staying, and that the risk had not been his to assume was acceptable. She said that was accurate. He said he had a request and that he understood he did not have a strong claim on her willingness to hear it, but that he was going to make it because it was the honest thing to do, and because he had spent 19 months being insufficiently honest, and he was trying to stop. She did not tell him to continue. She did not tell him to stop. She waited with the patience that had always been her most underestimated quality, and the waiting was itself a form of generosity that he accepted with the knowledge that he had not earned it. He said he would like her to understand that the matter of Lord Harwick's daughter was not advanced, that it had been proposed by Harwick and received without enthusiasm by him, and that he had not declined it promptly because he had not examined his own reasons for not declining promptly, and that examining them now, with the full clarity available to a man whose comfortable assumption had been removed, in the form of a note on a Saturday morning, he understood that the reason he had not declined promptly was the same reason he had not decided about the arrangement, which was that deciding required him to understand what he wanted, and what he wanted was the thing he had been allowing without acknowledging that he wanted it. She looked at the path ahead of them for a moment. She said she needed to know what he was saying. He said he was saying that he had spent 19 months in the company of a woman who had made every place she occupied worth occupying, and that he had received this as a condition of the arrangement rather than a quality of the person, and that the distinction had become clear to him at some cost, and that what he was asking, not assuming, not receiving, asking, was whether she would be willing to allow him the opportunity to demonstrate that he had understood the difference. She was quiet for long enough that he stopped walking, because walking while she was quiet felt presumptuous. She stopped too. She looked at him with the steady, clear attention that had always been her way of looking at things that deserved precision, and he received the look without the usual management, without the composure that composure had cost him for years, simply as a man standing in the early November cold asking something he genuinely did not know the answer to. She said she would think about it. She said it in the tone that meant the thinking would be real rather than procedural, and that the outcome was not determined, and that she was not offering the thinking as a courtesy but as the honest state of her consideration, and that he should understand the difference. He said he understood. He said he would wait. She said she knew he would, because waiting was easy and she had not asked for waiting. She had asked for something harder than waiting. She turned back toward the house, and he walked beside her, and neither of them said anything else, and the morning held them both in the particular quiet of two people who have said what they needed to say and are now giving it the room it requires. She thought for 3 weeks. He did not press. He did not write daily letters or appear at the gate with explanations or do any of the things that a man manages when he is trying to influence an outcome rather than allowing it to reach itself honestly. He waited, not because waiting was comfortable, it was not, but because he had finally understood that what she had asked for was not a performance of his sincerity but the evidence of it, and that evidence took the form of allowing her the full space of her own deliberation. She wrote to him at the end of the 3rd week. The letter was not long. It said that she was willing to begin, and that begin was the word she was using deliberately, because what she was not willing to do was return to what they had been, which had been sufficient for him and insufficient for her in ways that had accumulated into a Thursday and a note and a Saturday morning and everything that had followed. She was willing to begin something that was different from the arrangement in the specific and necessary way of something that had been decided rather than allowed, and that the deciding would have to be visible and not merely stated, and that she intended to hold him to the distinction. She would return on a Wednesday. He was there when she arrived, not as he had been when she had left, which was present in the house, in the ambient way of a man whose presence is a condition rather than a choice, but at the door, which was a small thing, and was not a small thing, was the particular small thing that this story had been moving toward since the first sentence, which was a man who had always been in the house, choosing to be at the door. She came up the steps, and he held it open, and she went inside, and the house was the same, and it was different, in the way that everything is different. When the people in it have finally agreed to see each other clearly, she would stay, or she would not. That was the honest position, and she held it with the same precision she had always held things. But the door had been opened, and not because no one had examined whether it should remain closed, because someone had finally, at some cost, decided to open it. The last things are the ones that last, not the arrangements, not the assumptions, not the comfortable dailiness of a life that has never been required to name itself. The last things are the moments when two people look at each other in the full light of what they are actually asking and actually offering, without the architecture of management between them. She had arrived at this house 19 months ago as a practical arrangement. She had made it worth living in. She had left when she understood what temporary meant, and on a Wednesday in November, she had walked back through its door not because she was returning to what she had been, but because they were beginning what they had not yet been, and beginning, when it is real, is the only thing that has ever actually mattered. Leave a like if this story stayed with you. It tells us that stories like this one deserve to be found. Subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who has been in a situation where they had to choose between what was comfortable and what was true, because the choosing is always the point. We will see you in the next story. There is always another one.